late 90s were filled to the brim with 3D platformers between the PS1 and the N64 that brought us so many beloved characters that we still talk about to this very day. Whether it's the big guys like Mario or the much more niche series like Gex, there were definitely a lot of games that were beloved by fans. But during the early parts of 3D in gaming, Sony was pretty much dominating the gaming industry with the PlayStation 1. But despite that, there was just one big market that Sony just couldn't have that Nintendo had a stranglehold on, which was the family-friendly market. And because of this, Sony wanted to take over that market as well, so they could pretty much take over the entirety of the gaming industry. And so, for the solution, Sony has contracted one of Universal Interactive Studios to work on a family-friendly project for the PlayStation 1. This studio so happens to be Insomniac Games. Now, this studio is mostly known these days for tackling the Spider-Man series, but before that, they were mostly known as the Ratchet & Clank studio. And since then, it was their flagship series. But before all of that, they started off making a small FPS game for the PS1 called Disruptor. And long story short, even though this game received well critically, it was a financial flop for Insomniac, so they decided to go to the drawing board. And this is when Sony shows up to contract Insomniac Games to make a 3D platformer for them so they can rival Mario 64. And as for the development history itself, well, it went pretty smoothly for the most part, especially compared to something what happened with Naughty Dog since they're both under the Universal Interactive umbrella. And as for what kind of 3D platformer they should do, they thought of having a game where you control a dragon, since a dragon has a lot of interesting ways for platforming, since they can fly and breathe fire. They also made the dragon purple so they can have him stick out so he doesn't blend in with the background. And this game was so happened to be called Spyro the Dragon, which released in 1998 and received very positive reviews and sold extremely well for Insomniac. As for my personal history with Spyro, well, I grew up with the second and fifth game in the series, with the latter being from the Nintendo GameCube and not the PlayStation, and I haven't tried the first or third one until years later. But my real Spyro fixation started when it released on the Nintendo Switch, where I got nearly 90 hours of playtime just for the reignited trilogy alone. But I'm mostly focusing on the PS1 game, and I'll talk about the reignited trilogy later in the video. So, with everything out of the way, let's get started. The story begins with a broadcast in the realm of the dragons. The news anchor questions the dragons about this nasty Nork character, who so happens to have a spell that can turn gems into warriors. And so, this arrogant dragon comments on Nasty with him watching the TV, where he calls him simple, no threat, and ugly. This really sets off Nasty, so out of spite, he calls a spell to go across the realms, where they turn all the dragons into crystals except for Spyro due to his short size. And so it's up to him to go across the realms and save all the dragons to defeat Nasty Nork. The story, by all means, is once again a very simple platformer. I do find it funny that the whole conflict in this game started because this dragon called the main villain ugly on TV. Something about that's just great. But anyway, so for the gameplay, Spyro the Dragon by all means is a very simple 3D platformer. You go through various levels, run around, get gems, and free all the dragons. How you release the dragons are also very simple because all you have to do is just tap on the crystal and they'll come free. Where they won't start talking to Spyro giving him certain tips, but a lot of them they'll just say the same lines, which is,
"Thank you for releasing me."
I'm not kidding, they say this line so many times that they actually reuse voice clips in the game.
"Thank you for releasing me."
The voice acting itself is not really great, but I don't know, there's something very charming about the line deliveries for some of these dragons, especially with this one.
Spyro, it's great to see you, but I've got to go.
Spyro also talks in this game as well, but the voice that they gave him for this one in particular is,
What about Nasty Nork? I'm going after him. Where's Nasty Nork? I'll torch him.
Yeah, his voice can be a bit on the grating side, but luckily he doesn't really talk too much in this game, so it doesn't really get too bothersome. I can't really blame the voice actor because it's more of the voice direction more than anything, because Carlos Alazraqui is a really good voice actor, as I listened to him for many years for my favorite Nickelodeon shows. So how Spyro controls is very simple, because as usual he can run, jump and such as much as any other platformer, but what sets him apart in particular is that he's a dragon. Which leads to having very interesting moveset, like for example, He can use his wings to glide in the air for a long distance to get into some certain secrets. Obviously, since dragons can breathe fire, Spyro uses this to have a little bit of a spread shot, which is very effective against enemies. And the second way he attacks is also using his horns and charge like a bull. This is also very effective and also pretty much allows you to run faster. And the best part is that you need to use both of these moves in very interesting ways because it's not like you can defeat all the enemies by using just flame or just charging. Some enemies will be too big to charge, so it's best to use fire to attack them, and some enemies will have metal armor which are fireproof, so it's best to charge them. And as for the level structure of each world, well, there are 6 hub worlds to explore, with 3 main levels within all of them. How you enter each world depends on which criteria you have, because sometimes you need to have a certain amount of gems, while others you need a free amount of certain dragons. There is a third collectible in this game, but it's way less common than the other 2, which are these little dragon eggs that are stolen by these thieves. However, unlike the gems where there's about 1,000 and the dragon eggs where it goes up to 80, there are only 12 dragon eggs throughout the game, and most of them are in World 3 of the game. And as for the level designs themselves, well, in Spyro, it has a lot bigger of an emphasis on vertical platforming. Take a level like Cliff Town, for example, where it has a lot of buildings that Spyro needs to explore. First things first is that you climb the tallest building, and once you do so, you can glide all the way to the mountainside. Now besides the crystal dragons, which are very easy to free, your main priority is just collecting gems, and I know that would sound very monotonous, but there's just something very satisfying of collecting as many gems as you can. I feel like the gems in this game really encourages you to explore throughout the entirety of the levels and find cool little secrets and crannies throughout, because if you just go through level to level, things can get a bit boring. The game has a lot of great variety in terms of what kind of world to be exploring in this game. Artisan Plain is pretty much the first one. It's your castle and plains level. Those here are very solid for the most part, and they are able to stick out for one another. Peacemaker is in the middle of a war, so with a lot of the levels, they're all based on battlegrounds and such. But my favorite world still has to be from Wizard Peaks, because I really love the aesthetic and everything about this area. It's located on top of a snowy mountainside, and it's the most magical area of the game. With the main new thing that they introduce in these levels are the supercharge, where if Spyro stands on this thing and charges, he moves a lot faster, it has a much more powerful charge, and once he goes off a slope, he flies up in the air. But once we leave the mountainside, we go all the way down to the swamp into Beastmaker, where the main thing is that the Norks has overtaken the swamp with all their mechanical stuff. Dreamweavers is located above in the sky, full of floating islands. And this applies to a lot of the enemies, where there are certain enemies that will boost up other enemies much more powerfully, and the only way to take them out is to take out the wizard. And lastly, we have Nasty's World, which is the home location of Gnasty Gnorc and his minions. And because of this is probably the most dangerous world in the game, because they want Spyro dead to the point where they actually wield actual machine guns. Now, despite all this, I think the difficulty in this game is on the easy side for the most part. Spyro can take about 4 hits before he dies, all thanks to his buddy Sparks that protects him from all the damage. And he'll even change color depending on what health he has right now. With the only way to heal up is to have him eat butterflies, which so happens to be in the small creatures that you find along the way, like sheep and such. But if you want some levels that are a bit more challenging, you can always go for the Speedway levels, because these are definitely the most challenging part of the game. With the main thing is that Spyro can fly in these levels, where he has to do 4 different tasks, which is either going through rings, destroying the amount of enemies and such. But the main challenge is doing all the tasks at once before the time limit goes out, which can be very daunting in the later levels, especially with Beastmaker, where to this very day I still struggle to figure out which way is the right path. Especially since the boss fights aren't going to give you any challenge at all. Alright, the boss fights in this game. Yeah, they suck. I'm not kidding you. Spyro 1 has literally the easiest bosses I've ever seen in a platformer. To the point where I even heard some people say that they didn't even notice they were fighting a boss in the game. The hardest boss area in the game for me was Dr. Shemp, not because of the boss fight itself, but because I had a hard time gliding to this one platforming area. But with all the bosses, I do have to say is that I think my favorite one has to be the first one, aka Toasty. Mostly because he's literally a sheep wearing a scarecrow costume to get revenge against the dragons. There is so much sheep abuse in this game that the commercials for Spyro the Dragon has a sheep boycotting it. which is honestly kind of funny, but it's honestly sad too, because even the final boss of this game is also a complete joke. You focus more on catching these thieves than the actual final boss. At the near end, he just goes down within 2 hits. However, if you do go for everything in the game, you also unlock one final bonus level called Nasty's Loot, which allows you to fly anywhere you want, grabbing as much treasure as you want, while having this amazing soundtrack in the background. Which also leads me to the presentation of this game, because for a PS1 game, this game looks pretty solid for the most part. Obviously, since it's a late 90s game, it does not hold up graphically, especially compared to today's standards. But, I don't know, there's a certain charm with the aesthetics that this game has, especially with how they implement the colors of the game. I feel like the colors of this game honestly makes the graphics a bit timeless, because it just has this magical, dreamlike aesthetic. And even the animations hold up surprisingly for a PS1 game. I know the original direction for the game is having the enemies feel very lively, and I think they nailed it for the most part. And the music in this game is also really good. Spyro the Dragon has some of my favorite soundtracks in video games, and this is all thanks to the amazing talent of Stuart Copeland. Now, this guy used to be part of a band called The Police, and Spyro the Dragon was so happened to be the first video game he ever composed. How he wrote the soundtracks was that he played through every single level of the game and tried to get a feel for the areas. Although in order to him to avoid having to struggle with the game in later parts of the levels when it gets harder, Insomniac Games gave him a version where Spyro is completely invincible. That way he can focus on writing a story rather than trying to focus on trying to beat a level. It was all documented in this interview for the creation of Spyro the Dragon, and they even show a little bit of the software they used to make the music.
They pay me for this.
So yeah, that was Spyro the Dragon, and overall, despite how simplistic it is, I'd still have a really good time playing through this game. Now, despite me preferring the later games of the series, I still play this game a lot for the most part, mostly because it's one of those games that just very relaxing to play through. Now, before we wrap things up, I think it's very fun just to talk about the various versions of Spyro 1, because you think besides the original one that the only other version is the reignited trilogy, but no, there was actually one more version of Spyro 1, which so happens to be the Japanese version of Spyro the Dragon. Now, usually I don't talk about regional differences, but for this case, I think it's very interesting to talk about because of how much of a difference that they changed the gameplay style for this. As the footage shows that instead of really moving the camera, they instead implemented a fixed camera angle instead. Not just that, but also Spyro's charge move that makes him go faster has been reduced to pretty much just his walking speed. This was due to the fact that there was a ton of complaint in the Japanese audience that Spyro the Dragon pretty much caused motion sickness apparently. And so, to compensate, they pretty much made the game a bit more slower pace and having a fixed camera angle to reduce that fact. And because of this, it honestly makes the gameplay feel extremely different from the other versions. But also, it essentially makes this the weakest version of Spyro the Dragon, especially compared to the next one we're going to be talking about. 20 years after Spyro 1 released, a remake of the first 3 games were released in the Spyro Reignited trilogy. And holy shit, this collection is so good. To the point where I literally have 90 hours on my Nintendo Switch. So yeah, created by Twisted Bob, this collection was not only supposed to give Spyro the Dragon to a new audience, but also overhaul the graphics into a beautiful way. And you can see that immediately once you turn on the opening cutscene of the game. I mean, goddamn, it's almost to the point of a Pixar cartoon. And I also like some of the changes that they added to the cutscene, like Nasty Nork being on the couch watching TV, which honestly makes a lot more sense how he heard about the news broadcast instead of just standing in place. And when you start playing the game, it's just like, holy crap, this game looks beautiful. Obviously, since I'm recording this on Nintendo Switch, it doesn't look as good as the other consoles, but even then, I still think this game looks really good. And the most impressive thing, too, is that they modeled literally every single dragon in the game, so it's not just a simple palette swap, because they also have their own unique animations and such. It is honestly very impressive. Especially considering that they're remaking not just one, but also 3 games in one product. And as for the gameplay, well, it's exactly the same from the original, but it controls so much better than the original as well. Now, don't get me wrong, the original PS1 game's controls really good, but this just feels so much more refined. The only criticism I have for the game is that the bosses aren't really much of an improvement. In fact, they're pretty much the same as the original, as in not very good. And also in the remake, they actually censored some of the enemies because in the final areas where they had actual machine guns, they were pretty much reduced to paintball guns. But luckily, it's not too much of a deal breaker because I feel like the positives of this remake way outshines the negatives about this remake. If you're very curious about playing Spyro, I highly recommend trying the Reignited trilogy. It looks better, it's a bit more streamlined, and most importantly, it's way more accessible because it's on all modern consoles. But despite that, I actually recommend trying out the PS1 version as well because it has a completely different experience from the remake, especially with all that PS1 charm. And the best part is that this game led the way to a bunch of great sequels, and I cannot wait to talk about them. But that'll do for today, so thank you for watching and I'll see you later. Bye bye!